This will be of no surprise to anyone, and it's certainly not the first time that he's said this. But David Haye says he wants to take on the winner of Anthony Joshua versus Vladimir Klitschko, and I suspect that he is desperately hoping that Anthony Joshua wins the fight rather than Klitschko, because he's already fought Klitschko and he lost in pretty one-sided fashion. It did go the distance, but David Haye won very few rounds in the fight. So from a stylistic point of view, I think that David Haye sees Anthony Joshua as having a style which is more complementary to his own in terms of his ability to win. So I'm going to quote David Haye directly here. He says, "It's not a burning thing. It's just a goal that I've set for myself to prove that I'm number one. It was always my goal to be ranked number one in the heavyweight division, and I had my chance to do that against Vladimir, but I failed and lost the fight on points. I'd like the opportunity to get into another big fight against a world champion who many people consider to be number one and beat him. The winner of Joshua and Klitschko, many people will consider that person to be number one in the division. If they're number one, I'd love the opportunity to test my skills against them. Big heavyweight fights, big title showdowns. That's always been the plan." So those are the words of David Haye. First and foremost, David Haye has got to get past Tony Bellew. Many people see that as a foregone conclusion. I had kind of a debate with somebody on social media recently who seemed like a younger boxing fan, and he was saying there's 0% chance of David Haye losing to Tony Bellew. It's impossible. Basically, that's what this guy was saying. He said that if Haye was to lose to Bellew, it would be an absolutely massive shock. And it's just impossible. It can't happen. Because if Haye was to lose to Bellew, that would make Bellew one of the best out there. And he's not. So therefore it can't happen and it's impossible. Very, very flawed logic indeed. I reminded this young man that historically far better fighters than David Haye have lost fights to far inferior fighters than Tony Bellew. And I'm talking in relative terms here because David Haye and Tony Bellew are essentially two cruiserweights. David Haye has campaigned at heavyweight, but he's really still a cruiserweight. So you're talking about two cruiserweights fighting here. Now, historically, you go back to Muhammad Ali losing to a 7-fight novice in Leon Spinks. Now, Leon Spinks was an Olympian, so on and so forth, but what did Leon Spinks do after beating Ali? He lost to Ali in a rematch and he went on to have a very mediocre career. Didn't really achieve anything of note after that. So Leon Spinks, not a particularly good fighter. And yet he beat one of the greatest fighters of all time, arguably the greatest heavyweight of all time, in their first fight, when he only had 7 professional fights. A guy who was a reigning champion. He beat him. Fast forward to, when was it, 1990, when Mike Tyson fought Buster Douglas, a guy who was regarded as a journeyman/fringe contender, a guy who was a 42-1 underdog, a guy who'd been stopped previously. He knocked out Mike Tyson. Fast forward again to the 90s. I can't remember which year it was. It might have been, was it 95, 93? I can't remember now. When Lennox Lewis fought Oliver McCall. Again, another guy who was regarded as a fringe contender/journeyman. He knocked Lennox Lewis out in the second round. A guy with numerous losses on his record, including a loss to Buster Douglas. And Lennox Lewis went on to prove himself to be one of the greatest heavyweights, certainly of the last few decades. And Oliver McCall, he had a couple wins after that, but he faded back into obscurity, really, as a fringe contender/journeyman, just like Buster Douglas did after the Tyson win. So if the likes of Leon Spinks can beat Ali, if McCall can beat Lewis, if Douglas can beat Tyson, then Tony Bellew beating David Haye is not that far-fetched. Is it likely? No. I think the most likely outcome is that David Haye walks through Tony Bellew. But would it be shocking? It wouldn't be shocking to me if Tony Bellew beat David Haye. David Haye's not that good. David Haye's no Muhammad Ali. He's no Mike Tyson. He's no Lennox Lewis. And Tony Bellew is not a journeyman / fringe contender. He's a current world champion. So the gap between a Tony Bellew and a David Haye is nowhere near as great as the gap between a Buster Douglas and a Mike Tyson, or a Leon Spinks and a Muhammad Ali, so on and so forth. It's not inconceivable at all that Tony Bellew could win. Particularly when David Haye has been out the ring for so long, has been fighting such a poor level of opposition, who's always had stamina problems, David Haye. Tony Bellew's been very active, so on and so forth. So no, it's not. It wouldn't be an enormous shock. Certainly not to me. Certainly not to somebody who's been around following the sport of boxing for as long as I have. It wouldn't turn my world upside down if Tony Bellew beat David Haye. It's not that big a shock. David Haye lost to Carl Thompson once upon a time. Is Carl Thompson that great? I mean, Carl Thompson was a guy who was 40 years old who had plenty of defeats. And yes, David Haye has improved since then, but, he's still vulnerable. So, anyway, as far as David Haye wanted to fight the Joshua Klitschko winner, as I alluded to, or as I mentioned in the early part of this video, from a stylistic point of view, I think David Haye likes the Joshua fight more because Joshua is more aggressive than Klitschko, and he hasn't really refined his game as much as Klitschko has, in my view. And I think this is what David Haye sees as well. He's more hittable than Klitschko. He doesn't have his clinch game on lock the way that Klitschko has his clinch game, where he can just shut you down if you're a smaller guy. As soon as you make any type of aggressive move, he'll grab hold of you, push you down, and there's literally nothing you can do, especially for a guy who is as offensively one-dimensional as David Haye. And I incurred a lot of criticism for saying this over the years, that David Haye is offensively one-dimensional. In my view, he is, particularly when he's fighting tall heavyweights, because he doesn't really set anything up with a jab. He don't go to the body. He don't really have much of a left hook at long range. I know he managed to land a left hook on Valleyweb, and people go on about that ad nauseum. But what left hooks did he land against the other tall heavyweights that he's fought? I mean, it's not really a punch that he delivers that much against big tall heavyweights. When you have to throw it at an upward trajectory, it's much more difficult. Although, in a lot of the training footage that I've noticed with Shane McGuigan, he's throwing more left hooks now, and he's throwing them with better form than he did earlier on in his career. So perhaps that's a punch that we will see David Haye use more, even against taller guys, because he's altered his stance. And again, a lot of people don't notice these things, but I've noticed that his stance under McGuigan has changed. Even when he's on the pads, it's different. He's throwing his left hook more. He's slightly more squared up than he used to be, I think. But that's to be able to crank that left hook and get more power in it and remain on balance with it. Regardless, certainly up until this point, David Haye has been one-dimensional offensively against tall heavyweights. All he really does is circle around and look to jump in with a big right hand. That's it. There's really nothing much more to what David Haye does against big tall heavyweights than that. So he's offensively limited. And Vladimir Klitschko exploited that and exposed that with, his tactics of jabbing, staying away from the big right hand. And then when David Haye did make any kind of aggressive move forward, lean on him, push him down, shut him down. There are no body punches from David Haye. There's no jab. So all you have to worry about is that big long range right hand that he tries to throw. And if you've got the height and reach and you've got quick feet and decent reflexes yourself, you can negate all that. Anthony Joshua, he likes to do different things in the ring. Could he really replicate what Klitschko did against Joshua? What Klitschko did against David Haye? Yeah, he could probably do it. He has the athleticism. His team would obviously have to look at the Klitschko fight and say, can we replicate that? Can we do the same thing? Just shut David Haye down tactically? Maybe they'll do that if the fight takes place. But in David Haye's head, he's probably telling himself that no, Joshua won't do that. Joshua will give him opportunities that Klitschko didn't give him. That's what I suspect anyway. If Klitschko's to win the fight, David Haye going up against Klitschko a second time, well, he'd get to prove, he'd get to at least attempt to prove what he said was the reason that he didn't perform first time around. He says that his toe did not allow him to spring off because he had a damaged little pinky toe. It didn't allow him to push off from his right foot and land his big right hand. Well, if Klitschko knocks out Joshua, we'll see if David Haye gets the opportunity. But as far as I'm aware, David Haye is not mandatory for any of the belts. But that could be something. Let's say Klitschko beats Joshua. He'll obviously have mandatories with Luis Ortiz and Kubrat Pulev to consider. The Pulev mandatory, I believe, takes priority. That one has to happen first. Will Pulev take that fight? Pulev might be hedging his bets at the moment. He might be thinking, okay, am I going to fight Klitschko if he beats Joshua? Because Klitschko cleaned me out. Maybe Pulev's hoping that Joshua wins the fight. I suspect that if Joshua wins the fight, Pulev will try and take the Joshua fight immediately. Depending on how impressive Joshua is. If he's too impressive, he might abandon that altogether and go the WBC route because he's highly ranked with the WBC. But certainly if Klitschko wins and wins impressively, I'll be fairly surprised if Kubrat Pulev decides to exercise his mandatory position and fight Klitschko again. I think he'll probably go the WBC route. So either way, if Klitschko wins, he'll have to either deal with at least one of Ortiz or Pulev. And once he gets past that, he may fancy a rematch with David Haye. It was easy work for him first time around. And he may be thinking, well, I'm not going to be around in boxing too much longer. David Haye is a big fight. If it makes sense financially, if we put the feelers out there and the crowd are responding well and they believe in David Haye again, then maybe we'll do it. It's safe enough. He's a credible name. He's just beaten Tony Bellew. If he beats Bellew, maybe we'll do it. From a financial point of view, if it makes sense, why not have that fight rather than go out there and try and take on people who are very dangerous but don't really bring much to the table in terms of money. So just some food for thought there. Drop your comments in the comment section below. Let me know how you feel about what David Haye has said. That he'd like to take on the winner of Joshua Klitschko. Obvious, yes. But how do you think he would do against the winner? And who do you think he's hoping is going to win the fight? How would his tactics change in a Klitschko rematch if that were to take place? Would his stance, which I believe has changed under Shane McGuigan, and his improved left hook play any part? I think that with his change of stance, it will make him more hittable against Vladimir Klitschko. Because essentially, in the first fight, his stance and his whole approach was extremely defensive. He was just looking for a counter right hand or the opportunity to lead off with a right hand anytime he saw Vladimir Klitschko maybe slightly off balance. That was it. There was nothing else. Under his new trainer, Shane McGuigan, he appears to be trying to do different things. Leading off with left hooks more, using his jab more, throwing more combinations. And those things are good. But against somebody like Klitschko, I think they're just going to leave him more vulnerable at the same time. Yeah, they'll maybe open up more opportunities for him to land on Klitschko, but they'll also open up more opportunities for Klitschko to land on him. And Klitschko is still one of the most devastating punches in the sport of boxing. And I know David Haye took a couple of right-handers off Klitschko in the first fight, but he was pulling away. He never really caught those right-handers with absolute full Klitschko power. If he did, that fight wouldn't have gone 12 rounds, in my view. So, we'll see. Anyway, let me not long this video out too much. Drop your comments below. Let me know how you feel about everything I've talked about and mentioned. All right? It's happening. I'm out.